Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, Abe's Odyssey, Abe's Exodus, the Commandos series, Metal Gear Ghost Babel, and Trilby: The Art of Theft. All had been praised for their unique qualities as video games, and each was influential in its own right, but none of them had managed to spark a continuing mainstream interest in 2D stealth-based gameplay. The reasons for this are arguable and complex, depending on which games we look at and when they were made, but there is a common denominator: bad timing. In 1990, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake's influence was limited by a growing market preference for fast-paced action games. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake's nuanced stealth-based gameplay was well received, but its legacy would only be picked up nearly a decade later. In 1997 and 1998, the Oddworld Games and Commandos Behind Enemy Lines pitched some new, stealth-based directions for 2D gameplay. However, this was at a time when 3D gameplay and, more importantly, 3D stealth-based gameplay was starting to become driving forces in game design. Metal Gear Ghost Babel, though one of the Game Boy Color's most popular and enduring titles, faced a similar problem a couple of years later in 2000. This was compounded by the fact that the Metal Gear brand had by then established itself as part of the 3D stealth game movement with Metal Gear Solid. Throughout the mid-2000s, the Classroom games, the Ultimate Assassin games, and Ninja Rinse-Out found an audience despite their simplicity. Sites like Newgrounds became the home of an active smaller games culture who readily embraced these titles and many more besides. Yet their status as free, browser-based games made them easy to miss, and perhaps easy to ignore in terms of their significance, especially at a time when 3D stealth game franchises were enjoying their golden age. Trilby: The Art of Theft was probably the most admired smaller 2D stealth game on offer throughout the mid-2000s. Stealth enthusiasts gravitated towards it, and being a video game produced by one of the industry's most infamous critics, it drew plenty of attention from elsewhere as well. That being said, Trilby: The Art of Theft was not released as a commercial product. It was a free game anyone could download, and was much smaller compared to its mainstream 2D stealth predecessors. One could argue that the nature of these later 2D stealth-based games was evidence that 2D stealth was not a marketable concept in gaming at the time. Yes, lots of people had played The Classroom, Ultimate Assassin, Ninja Rinse-Out, and Trilby: The Art of Theft, but these were free games, so why wouldn't people play them? Scaled against the likes of Metal Gear Solid, Thief, Splinter Cell, Hitman, and Deus Ex, to name but a few, it was difficult to imagine that consumers would be prepared to spend money on simpler, smaller games. During the early to mid-2000s, there was an industry-wide perception that smaller games were niche products, certainly not something the so-called hardcore gamer, and therefore the heavyweight developers in the business, would be interested in, not when compared to the impact, both financial and cultural, of big, premium video games. This was a line of thinking that would soon change. Based on the history of 2D stealth games we've covered so far, going all the way back to 1990 with Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake and continuing into 2009 with Ultimate Assassin 2, a period spanning nearly 2 decades, we could argue that 4 conditions were required across the games industry and gaming culture in order for 2D stealth games to take root and grow into a continuing subgenre. Popularization of stealth-based game design, improvement in the creative technologies available to aspiring game developers, the rise of digital distribution platforms, and the rebirth of independent games development, or the preferred modern term, indie games. Throughout the early 2000s, the first 3 of these conditions were firmly established. Thanks to the class of '98 and the games they inspired, stealth became a viable method of play for enthusiasts, as well as a key selling point for games that featured stealth-based game design. Eventually, stealth would find its way into other video game genres, including first-person shooters and role-playing games. The rapid acceleration of what game engines, processors, internet technologies, and even the most rudimentary of home computers could do meant that creative tools became more affordable and more widely available to home users. You no longer had to work for a company with deep pockets in order to create video games. Meanwhile, digital distribution platforms blossomed in tandem with the advancement of mobile devices such as iPods, smartphones, and laptops. Music albums and small games became common paid-for downloads, and it wasn't long before the bigger players in the games industry noticed the revenue potential. The core of the games industry's retail sector had been on the high street throughout the 1990s. By the middle of the following decade, it had partially migrated into various online spaces. The modern indie games sector grew quickly once the required technologies and distribution platforms presented themselves, attracting creators, investors, and publishers. Nevertheless, it took a few years before indie games routinely drew attention from gaming audiences. Smaller games had been commercially successful products across a range of devices throughout the early 2000s, but if there was a year we could point to and say, this is the year indie games started to be taken seriously, 2008 would be a likely candidate. Microsoft pushed a select group of indie games to the front of their Xbox 360's digital distribution platform, the Xbox Live Arcade, for their 2008 Summer of Arcade event. 5 weeks, 5 games, 5 spots at the top of the Xbox 360 storefront. The games released throughout this 5-week period were, in alphabetical order, Bionic Commando Rearmed, Braid, Castle Crashers, Galaga Legions, and Geometry Wars Retro Evolved 2. 3 of these games proved to be hugely successful both critically and commercially, while the other 2 also produced significant sales figures. Microsoft's 2008 Summer of Arcade event had proven that indie games were the new hot items on digital distribution platforms. This wasn't a flash in the pan or a statistical anomaly, it was a growing trend, backed up by both consumer demand and critical praise for indie games. The so-called bedroom developers had returned to the games industry, and we were increasingly keen to see what they had to offer. In the following years, indie games would become the new medium in gaming culture, where rules and established game designs were tested and in some cases shattered altogether by emerging niche genres that constructed rules and game designs of their own. As long as developers worked within a given distribution platform's technical constraints, they could create whatever kind of game they wanted to, take inspiration from wherever they wanted to. At last, with all 4 of these conditions in place, it was only a matter of time until someone had the bright idea to create a new 2D stealth game. Stealth Bastard Tactical Espionage Arsehole was initially released as a freeware game in 2011 by Curve Studios, seeming to follow in the download for free approach of Ben Crawshaw's Trilby, The Art of Theft. Developed by Jonathan Biddle as a kind of cross between hardcore indie game platformer Super Meat Boy and the now iconic Metal Gear Solid, Stealth Bastard was surprisingly well received by PC gamers and managed to attract a strong following within months of its release. Players take on the role of a chubby clone with stealth goggles who has to tackle a series of test chambers filled with gruesome traps, robots, and guard drones. Like Trilby the Art of Theft, Stealth Bastard uses lighting in its environments in which your character can be fully visible, partially visible, or invisible. Players are taught that sticking to the shadows and avoiding detection by security devices is paramount to their survival, and when this is combined with the Twitch platformer gameplay, the experience can be unforgiving. In fact, whether intentional or not, Stealth Bastard has echoes of Abe's Odyssey and Abe's Exodus contained within its set pieces. You are mobile, but also vulnerable. The only way to deal with enemies is to avoid them altogether, much like the other obstacles in the game. Move too soon, and your character dies. Move too late, and your character dies. Get detected by one of the many security cameras, and at the very least your path is blocked. But more often than not, your character dies. Stealth Bastard gives players a basic understanding of how its various murder rooms work, throws hardcore platforming and stealth-based gameplay into the mix, then sits back and watches as we adapt, succeed, and fail repeatedly. Unlike the Oddworld games, there is a generous margin for error when it comes to being detected in Stealth Bastard, provided that you don't run straight into a security device with no regard for how visible you are. Visibility levels are displayed at all times in the centre bottom of the screen, the colour coding from safe green to warning yellow and danger red. If enemies spot the player character in low-level lighting, it triggers their suspicious behaviour patterns. A question mark indicator appears over their heads, and they investigate. At this point, it's advisable to crouch, which sometimes lowers the visibility level, and if that doesn't work, then sneak away slowly. If the player doesn't move, or stays in partial lighting, a red field will emit from the enemy's sensors, and narrow until it homes in on the player's location. Once their active state of awareness takes over, an exclamation point appears above enemies' heads, and there's likely to be only one possible outcome. Stealth Bastard's success as a freeware game encouraged Curve Studios to further develop its 2D stealth debut. A year later, in November 2012, the game was released commercially on Steam as Stealth Bastard Deluxe. This improved version not only had more levels, but gradual difficulty curves when introducing new mechanisms into its game space. These mechanisms now included sound, where players had to sneak across noisy floor tiles without alerting the security drones that were unable to see, but could hear extremely well. Completing rooms quickly without being detected or dying could earn players higher ranks, which in turn unlocked specialist equipment they could use, as well as bonus levels. In addition to this were boss rooms at the end of each area, where a sentinel drone sat in the middle of the level, and players had to, somehow, get past it without being vivisected by its lightning-fast laser defences, using all the tricks they had learned in the test chambers leading up to it. A narrative was put in place to account for your clone's origins and reveal the nature of their sneaky endeavours. As it turned out, players were not infiltrating a sinister factory filled with traps, but trying to escape from one. Stealth Bastard managed to tap into the things that made stealth-based gameplay unique and interesting. It built on the same rush of excitement that fueled Abe's Odyssey and Abe's Exodus in their 2D stealth platforming sections. At the same time, Biddle and his team at Curve Studios were smart enough to recognise that players would quickly tire of a game that forced them to replay whole levels, and so Stealth Bastard features a competently structured checkpoint system in each of its murder rooms. The most confusing aspect of Stealth Bastard turned out to be its title. To some audiences, this game is known as Stealth Inc. A Clone in the Dark, as the original British title was deemed inappropriate for audiences. 2D stealth was still considered to be an untested design concept, at least as far as modern indie games were concerned, so it was only natural that Curve Studios released an early version of this game for free to gauge potential interest. It just so happened that in 2012, a couple of months before Stealth Bastard Deluxe was released, another 2D stealth game of an entirely different nature would sneak up and catch audiences off guard. Approximately 22 years after the release of Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, the world's first comprehensive 2D stealth game, the 2D stealth subgenre finally got what critics often describe as a Citizen Kane moment. Except Citizen Kane was a tattooed ninja, silently carving his way to the top of a rotten corporation. Developed by Clay Entertainment, Mark of the Ninja brought stealth-based gameplay to a 2D side-scroller setting, fluidly guiding players from scenario to scenario in gigantic levels, where they could use a small arsenal of ninja skills to neutralise or bypass the obstacles they faced. Mark of the Ninja took its core functionality from the 3D stealth games that had preceded it, the stealth kills and point scoring introduced by the Tenchu series, the interplay of light and shadow that was emphasised by the Thief games, and the distinct AI awareness levels that were first put forward by the Metal Gear franchise. Mark of the Ninja built its own 2D stealth identity around these components. Unlike Tenchu, where the cinematic stealth kill was an aesthetic rather than functional gameplay feature, Mark of the Ninja used it as a small, albeit crucial test of player skill. Every attempt to kill a guard quickly and efficiently had to satisfy a QuickTime event, or QTE, where 2 specific command prompts appeared on screen and had to be pressed in time. If players failed this challenge, the guard was still neutralised, but they made a lot of noise before going down, and the player's in-game score suffered penalties as a result. Where Thief had explored the nuances of light and dark, with different grades of visibility, Mark of the Ninja took a more direct, binary approach. Either your ninja character was in the light and could be seen from a distance, or they were in the shadows and could not be seen unless an enemy got close to them. The 3 classic levels of enemy awareness, passive, suspicious and active, were programmed into Mark of the Ninja's own AI. The instantly recognisable question mark and exclamation point indicators also found their way into the game, denoting the suspicious and active states of awareness respectively. But Clay Entertainment took this a step further, sourcing inspiration from the recent 3D Batman Arkham games, and gave enemies a terrified state of awareness. While terrified guards weren't aware of the player's location and didn't trigger a full alert, they would behave erratically and shoot at anything that spooked them, meaning the player would have to time their moves carefully if they wanted to avoid getting shot. This was one of the games that kick-started the 2D stealth subgenre into overdrive, and we have to ask ourselves, what was so different between Mark of the Ninja and the 2D stealth games that came before it? Why was it successful in appealing to gamers who didn't usually find stealth-based games enjoyable to play? The answer is, as ever, complex, but it can be boiled down to a core principle in Mark of the Ninja's design. The game is very good when it comes to helping players understand its information space. Speaking to Gamasutra in late 2012, Nels Anderson, the lead designer for Mark of the Ninja, describes the heresies of the ninja, 5 principles of stealth-based game design that he and his team adhered to. Transparent stealth system, transparent AI, narrow gulf of execution, limited consequences for failure, and less open world design. If you're interested in game design in general, you should consider the full article as essential reading, but for the purposes of this video, we are interested in just 3 of these design concepts, because Mark of the Ninja was the first 2D stealth game to use all of them. Its transparent stealth system can be broken down into 2 key information spaces between the player and the AI, the aural information space and the visual information space. Both of these are relayed to the player via on-screen indicators in a fashion that's far subtler than using a heads-up display. Mark of the Ninja uses a binary stealth system. If your character is in the light, they are coloured and potentially visible to enemies. If your character is in the shadows, they turn almost black with white outlines, and they are invisible, at least until enemies are right on top of them. This seemingly small aesthetic choice is a crucial communication tool for the player to know when they are visually detectable and when they are not. As for the aural information space, any noise produced from running, climbing or using equipment generates a circular noise zone. The louder the noise, the louder its potential zone of influence will be, and the higher the chances that it'll be heard by enemies. The second principle of stealth-based game design used by Mark of the Ninja is the transparent AI. The game leaves no doubts in players' minds when it comes to what causes their enemies to switch to a higher state of alertness. Whenever enemies detect signs of player activity, they move to investigate the source of the disturbance, which is highlighted by a yellow on-screen indicator. Question mark icons appear above enemies' heads denoting their suspicion, along with a ring that gradually dissolves to show how long this state of awareness will last for. If an alert is triggered, it is always made clear what enemies noticed just before they turn active. A red indicator paints over the player's position, and exclamation point icons appear over guards' heads before they engage the player directly. Clay Entertainment added their own unique icon to symbolise enemies who were terrified, a distorted white exclamation point. The player could manipulate enemy states of awareness for their own ends, by using equipment or deliberately leaving signs of their presence to draw guards away from their patrol routes and disrupt their patterns of behaviour. The overall point of transparent AI was that the player could know what their opponent's current state of awareness was by simply looking at them. The third and final heresy of the ninja we should look at is the narrow gulf of execution. In the simplest possible terms, this means don't waste the player's time with skill-based gameplay. What Anderson and his team understood about the 2D stealth game they were trying to make was that it should draw players into its stealth-based scenarios. If the player wants to take out a searchlight or two, they can do this with a couple of button presses and never have to worry about how to aim their ninja's throwing knives. If they want to dash from cover to cover, or perhaps set a trap for a nearby guard, this can also be done with relative ease. Scaling walls, grappling from perch to perch, performing a stealth kill on a guard, all of this and more was made as easy to achieve as possible, with minor caveats such as the aforementioned QuickTime events. Stealth-based gameplay, for Mark of the Ninja, was predominantly set around your intentions rather than the execution of them. If you failed to stay hidden, it was because of your choices rather than your lack of ability. Mark of the Ninja was a critical success because it followed the templates of traditional 3D stealth-based games only so far. It was also superbly presented. Its animation, art style and sound design all helped to immerse players in a convincing stealth-based experience. It also gave players a steady difficulty curve in terms of the scenarios they had to tackle and the variety of obstacles they had to face. Between its narrative and gameplay features, Mark of the Ninja is an effective piece of indie gaming that makes everyone who plays it feel like they are one of the Shadow Warriors of legend. For 2D stealth games to flourish, we needed 3D stealth games to inspire gaming audiences and creators. We needed more affordable software and game engines. We needed new publishing methods in the form of digital distribution platforms like app stores, the Xbox Live Arcade, the PlayStation Network and Steam. We also needed smaller, independently created games to be marketable products for the modern gaming world. But even with all these things, it was still not enough. Once we had those components, those basic requirements to launch a new subgenre beyond the games we knew, we needed trailblazers for 2D stealth. And those trailblazers were games like Trilby the Art of Theft, Stealth Bastard and Mark of the Ninja. However, this was not another Class of '98 moment. Stealth was not a new idea. 2D stealth wasn't even a new idea, as we can see from how far back these games truly go, and how diverse they have been in terms of the gameplay experiences they offered us. No, 2012 was simply the year we began to witness the full emergence of the 2D stealth subgenre. Stealth Bastard and Mark of the Ninja may have been the heralds of this renaissance, but other 2D stealth games were already in development with their own ideas. Of course, genres and subgenres go through curves of popularity, so there will likely come a time when 2D stealth games are less widespread than they appear to be now, but if 2D stealth games have proved anything, it's that good ideas never die. They hide in the shadows of our minds, waiting for fresh opportunities to strike. I'd like to express my unending gratitude to all my sponsors on Patreon. Thanks to you, we've reached the first milestone goal of this project. You are all splendid people, so, again, thank you. Big thanks as well to my subscribers here on YouTube and supporters across the wider gaming community. I hope you continue to enjoy the work I'm doing here. If you're a new viewer, please subscribe if you liked what you've seen here and want to see more of it. For those of you who are thinking about taking that extra step and supporting the work of the Stealth Docs channel, you can do so by pledging $1 or $5 on my Patreon page. Hitting the like button, sharing and recommending this video are also great ways to support the work I'm doing here. Thanks for watching. You'll hear from me again soon.